Yes, I am so excited. We are starting a new book in the Bible. That's right, we're going to start in Exodus. This is James for the World's Last Night. Now, the book of Exodus, by the way, if you've never heard it before, is sometimes considered the central book of the Old Testament. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think I've said this before, but by the end of the book, maybe we'll have a newfound respect for it. I have actually gone ahead and read all the way through like chapter 5 of Leviticus. And so I'm really excited to kind of backtrack, to go back to the beginning of Exodus. But I'm also glad that I did read so far ahead because it reminded me that I don't know if I've told you about how the Old Testament is split up as far as the Hebrew Bible is concerned. Now, the Hebrew Bible is the Old Testament. I believe the Hebrew word is the Tanakh. Don't hold me to that. As we've talked about, the first 5 books is the Pentateuch, believed to be written by Moses. Well, the Pentateuch is also considered the law. So the Hebrew Old Testament is broken up into 3 different parts. You have the law, the writings, and the prophets. So now the law, and actually you hear those. This will make the New Testament make more sense to you because you hear those words used in the New Testament. Jesus might refer to, Moses' law. When he's saying that, he's referring to the first 5 books of the Bible. You might hear someone say, yeah, I've kept all the commands and the law and the prophets. And so they're referring to actual books. They're not necessarily referring to quote-unquote prophets. They're referring to the books that are considered the prophets. Now, those books are also the ones written by prophets. So they're like Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc. So you have the law, which is including Leviticus, Exodus, Genesis, although I don't really understand why Genesis is included in that because we don't actually get the Mosaic. Mosaic being Moses, that's Mosaic, Moses. The Mosaic law until the latter half of Exodus. But then you have the writings. Now, the writings are my personal favorite books in the Old Testament. When we get to the second half of Exodus and we get into a lot of Leviticus, you might actually find I'm going to be skipping a lot of stuff. Once you've explained a portion of it, there's really no reason to explain the rest. You can read it on your own, those little sections. It's not my favorite to read. The applicability to the modern day Christian of the Levitical law is pretty negligible. And we're going to talk more about that, I guess, when we hit that book or just the latter half of Exodus. But the writings are where all the stories come from that, as a child you may have heard about, like David and Goliath or like Samson. Samson would be in the book of Judges. David and Goliath, you're going to find that in Samuel, which is actually my favorite Old Testament book to start in. Probably out of every Old Testament book, 1st and 2nd Samuel are the ones I've read the most because I love the stories. They're awesome. But you also have books like Ruth and Esther. Esther is an amazing story. It's just like so well written, and there's a reversal in there. A story reversal, it's just excellent. Okay, I'll move on. When we get to that book, I'll talk more about it. But then you have the prophets. As I said, you have like Isaiah, Jeremiah. There's several prophets, and that's split up into the major and the minor prophets also. So I just wanted to kind of put it into perspective that we're actually about to get into the law. But before we get to that section to where God starts to hand down a law to Moses, we get to read about the Exodus itself. Now, I'm not going to really tee it up any more than Genesis already has, which is we know that the Hebrews are in Egypt now due to the famines, due to what Joseph did, cleared the way for them. Well, that Pharaoh that loved Joseph so much, he's going to die, right? Joseph dies, and eventually the Hebrews are going to be seen as a threat to Egypt because of their how fast they multiply. That's why they get pulled into slavery. Okay, I'm not going to foreshadow anymore. We're just going to get into the text now. I'm real excited. Here we go, chapter 1, verse 1, Exodus. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. Each came with his family: Reuben, Simon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The total number of Jacob's descendants was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. So this is just a little bit of recap. This is letting you know that we are following from what happened in Genesis directly after that. Now, we will very much skip ahead about 430 years here in a second. Okay, but we've talked about this. So verse 6, then Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful, increased rapidly, multiplied, and became extremely numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Now, I've also talked about kind of Hebrew writing styles, how they like to repeat things. And the more times it's repeated, the more emphasis they have on it. I like to equate it to having an exclamation point. So here we're hearing that they are fruitful, increasing rapidly, multiplied, and extremely numerous. I mean, they just told us the same thing 4 times in a row, but they really want to stick it in your head that this clan of 70 that we just talked about, it actually grows to about 2 million people. We're going to find there's 600,000 men. So that doesn't include the women and children. Okay, verse 8, a new king, which would be Pharaoh, right, who had not known Joseph, came to power in Egypt. He said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and powerful than we are. Let us deal shrewdly with them. Otherwise, they will multiply further. And if war breaks out, they may join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So just a little bit of history here. At this time in Egypt, there was an enemy to the north, the Hittite nation. So the Egyptians were particularly scared of the Hittite nation, that if they invaded, that these Hebrews might actually wage war against Egypt. So this quote-unquote shrewd new Pharaoh wants to deal harshly with the Hebrews to prevent them from rebelling. All right, so the Egyptians assigned taskmasters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. That's slavery. They built Pithom and Ramses as supply cities for Pharaoh. But the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. Now, I recently learned something because I wanted to go and make a analogy. This was like a month ago. I was filming a children's show. I wanted to make an analogy on this show about how coal under pressure turns into diamonds. Apparently, that's not exactly true, but it's still a good analogy if it were true, to this, that the more pressure Egypt puts upon these people, the more they multiply. And that lets you know that it's not Pharaoh versus the Israelites. It's Pharaoh versus the Israelites plus God. And when you have the plus God, it doesn't matter how sorry the first part of that equation is, the Israelites, how enslaved or whatever they are, they're going to still be prosperous because God wants them to, which I'm sure just upset Pharaoh even more, which is great. All right. They worked the Israelites ruthlessly and made their lives bitter with difficult labor in brick and mortar and in all kinds of field work. They ruthlessly imposed all this work on them. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah. Shiphrah? Shiphrah. Okay, I think it would be a pretty name if I could pronounce it correctly. These two names, if I remember, one means beautiful and the other one means splendor. Yeah, I think it's splendor and beautiful. But these aren't just the only two midwives for all these 2 million people. These are going to be the head of the organization of midwives. Okay, and so the king is saying to these midwives, when you help the Hebrew women give birth, when you help the Hebrew women give birth, observe them as they deliver. If the child is a son, kill him. But if it's a daughter, she may live. So that's cruel, like unbelievably cruel for me to actually think about. But basically, if a boy's being born, he wants to wipe out the Hebrews in one generation by killing all the males. Then they're just going to have a lot of females grow up without husbands, and eventually, it's just devastating to a people group to do that. So that's his plan. What I want you to think about as a Christian, because you and I are more aware of our enemy. That even though God is working during this time, Satan is also working. And you do remember God promised when he cursed Satan that a child of Eve is one day going to crush his head. And so it's not like Satan's been unaware of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the plans that God is sort of working out. He doesn't know the future. He can't predict the future. He's kind of hamstrung by that. But he has guesses, and he thinks there's something special about these people, and that perhaps this Messiah might come through these people. So he's the one whispering in Pharaoh's ear at night as he dreams, to give him these wicked ideas, right? To give him the cruel idea to kill all the male born. And we know that Herod does the same thing in the New Testament, right? Satan can sometimes be a one-trick pony, and that trick sometimes works, but God, right? But not because of God. God's not going to let it work in this instance. He made the promise, the Messiah is coming. Satan really can't do anything about it, no matter how hard he churns and toils, right? But I just want you to know that there is definitely a war going on the spiritual side, even in the Old Testament. So, okay. If it's a daughter, she may live. Verse 17, the Hebrew midwives, however, feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this and let the boys live? So these midwives are really brave for disobeying Pharaoh. They obviously, and this is where the fear of God comes in. A lot of people don't understand what the fear of God is. It's really a deep respect. It means you hold him in honor and as a priority above all else in your life. But there's also something to be said about actual fear, because he is also the God that can take away the life that he gave you, and he is the same God that can punish you eternally in hell. So there's a little bit of that to it also. That's not what we like to preach usually, but that's part of it. You sin, you deserve God's wrath. That's the end of that story there. However, these midwives apparently fear God more than they fear Pharaoh. And that's important. And it's something that as Christians we have to come to terms with when we relate to our governments. That sometimes we're going to have to disobey our government if it demands something of us that is ungodly. That would go against God, because there is a higher authority in this world than our government. And Christians throughout time have always faced persecution. Even today in America, they won't tell you this. They never talk about it, the media. But still today in the world, the number one most oppressed people group are Christians. And they're not in America. They're in other countries. A lot of these Christians have to make up their mind that they are not going to, say in the Middle East, convert to Islam, that they would rather die than do that. Or you go back into the last century, you're looking at like communist Romania, where the Christian church was heavily persecuted. Christians were tortured and martyred if they would not give up their faith and put the government over them instead of God. Now, you and I hopefully never have to be subjected to that. But if we ever are, we hope that we can be like these midwives and obey God and honor God over what a person in power over us, tells us to do. So I'll keep reading. The midwives said to Pharaoh, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before a midwife can get to them. So theologians, some say, actually, I literally have read some say that these women are probably not lying, or there's no reason to assume they're lying. Me personally, I think they're probably fibbing. But I don't know. They may not be. It could be the Hebrew women are actually really good at birthing children. But anyways, they make this excuse. And then verse 20 says, so God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very numerous. Since the midwives feared God, he gave them families. So that's great, because midwives, typically would not be people that have their own children. They, at this time anyways, they would be dedicated to, helping other women deliver their children. So it looks like God blesses them for resisting Pharaoh. Pharaoh then commanded all his people, because he doesn't want to give up, "You must throw every son born to the Hebrews into the Nile, but let every daughter live." So he's upping the ante here. He's commanding all his people, which I guess would be not just the midwives, that basically you got to throw every son born to the Hebrews into the Nile. And so they are going to institute this as a policy. And as you know, throughout time, this is probably the first real good instance of it, but throughout time, the Jews have always been persecuted and singled out. So even today, it's a small faction in America. There's still a small faction of anti-Semites in America that hate Jews. Now, if you go back to Europe and what led up to the Holocaust, you're going to find the reasons for the hatred of Jews are kind of interesting. Because what ended up happening, I believe, if I remember correctly, is that a great deal of Jews were kicked out of Spain. And what they ended up doing is moving throughout Europe, looking for work, and they became hated and despised because they were lower class. So they are a marginalized people living throughout Europe, hated and despised. Now, laws are then passed that basically say if you're a Jew, you can't have certain occupations. So the only occupation that they end up being able to excel in is actually banking, believe it or not. Because at this time, before the Industrial Revolution, banking isn't a big industry. It's not something you make a ton of money in because who's investing, right? There's not factories or mass production or extreme forms of capitalism for investing at this time. So they're not making a lot of money. They're still considered, fringe of society, low class, don't want to be associated with them, laws that make it to where they can't have certain occupations. But then along comes the Industrial Revolution. And what happens? People want to take loans out. They want to invest in factories. And so they have to go to the bankers, and most of the bankers are Jewish. Now you get where a lot of the tropes come from about Jewish people and money and banking and all that. But the reason that they are stereotypically or notorious for that industry is quite sad, right? As I just explained. So now they're coming to them, and suddenly banking is like a huge industry, and they're making tons of money, and then they become despised again. Right? Because now they're upper class, and they were supposed to be lower class. And so they're oppressed again. Anyways, so throughout all of time, the Jewish people have been oppressed, and we see it starting hardcore in Exodus right here as Pharaoh wants to completely eliminate their bloodline by killing all the males. This is the end of chapter 1. Now, we have a lot to go through. We're going to see in the next chapter Moses being born and what happens to him, right? Because he's a Jewish son, so he's supposed to be murdered. But God has provision. He's all about a remnant, and he has a plan to save his people and to bring him out of this terrible captivity. So we're going to delve into that next, and I might talk a little bit more about the book of Exodus at the beginning of the chapter 2. So until then, this is James from The World's Last Night.